Hi guys, my name is Pruthi. I'm a DevOps lead here at Velotio Technologies. Today we are here to cover the third part in the observability series, which is traces. In the past two parts, I've covered about metrics and logs, and you can find them on Velotio's YouTube channel. So yeah, let's get started on like what traces are and how we can start tracing. So let me share my screen. So like we discussed, we're going to be talking about tracing, which is like the third section. First two sections we have talked about metrics and logs. Yeah. So what is traces? What is tracing? So it's a method to track basically user requests through the entirety of like how it travels through the different components in the microservices architecture, right? And the two most important data points that are collected with distributed tracing are the time taken to traverse each component and the sequential flow of requests. So that basically helps you identify that how your request is traveling through the system. I mean, on the left, if you see, you see the different services A, B, C, D, and how the context is basically transmitted across through all the services, and that is how your trace is constructed in the backend using context, right? So, what is in general the tracing strategy? So, this application is basically a open telemetry or Jaeger SDK that or Zipkin SDK that is basically writing traces to an agent which serves as a buffering layer before putting it into DB. So this buffering layer is optional. It can directly be put into DB, but kinds of become overwhelming for the DB if the requests are too high. And then Grafana is basically used for visualization. Okay, so let's go to the tempo architecture. So this tempo architecture is very similar to what we had for Loki, where we have got this SDKs generating traces which are ingested to the storage using distributor and ingester, where it is basically ingested into an object storage. Now this caching layer is basically implemented to improve the query response time, right? And this compactor is basically it compacts the data after a certain amount of time and puts it back into the storage for optimal storage utilization. Okay, and basically this also generates some metrics around traces, and if you want to ingest it into your metrics backend, that can also be done. So now let's talk about the third concept called sampling. So tracing all the user requests can like become very taxing for your system. So to solve that problem, we basically sample the request. So there are different techniques to sample. So head based and tail based are like promoted by Tempo. So head based is some. So there may be some samples which you might not want to store in your DB. Suppose that is the /health or /life/ready request, which might again be making requests to different services in your microservices architecture and then coming back. And so you might not want to save it because that just gives you the health of the system. So you can reject it right at the start of your tracing, right? So that is head-based sampling. Tail-based sampling happens when you've collected all the traces and now you want to decide whether you want to put it in the DB or not. So, for example, if you see the option below where we are sampling the traces only if the threshold is greater than 100 and if the status code is error. Similarly, random sampling, which is basically storing like a percentage of your requests in DB. So if you just store 3%, 20% of your user requests are coming into DB. But that is like prone to errors where you might miss out the actual the long tails that so it will become difficult for you to identify what issue has happened with the system. And similarly, adaptive sampling is basically when your system adapts to the traffic changes that are happening in production system to make sure that you sample only that percentage of requests or only those number of requests so that your sampling budget is not exceeded or tracing budget is not exceeded. So now how do you link these metric logs and traces together? So we'll see that in a demo, but we'll do that with the help of exemplars. So exemplars are nothing but examples which are basically a label that is added to your Prometheus metric to tell to basically link your metrics to your traces, right? We'll see that in an example. And similarly, using similarly, traces can be linked to logs using the similar concept. It's not exemplars, but it's using derived fields. You can link it to link your Loki to tempo. So let's see an example. So I've got this application running, tracing example by Joe Elliott, and I've got this Grafana running. So if you see here, if I run this query, I've basically I'm calculating the P99 for the request latency. So these are exemplars. So this exemplar basically tells us that this is the tracing ID and this is the timestamp. So once I click on that, it will basically take me to the request. And so this is basically a trace request, and this basically tells that so currently it is just like a recursion of like one process calling itself. So, and there is like some long running processes. So basically it basically tells us that this is a long running process that is run for 101 millisecond, right? And we can even log messages at certain points in time. So we're like using instrumentation. And this basically helps us identify, okay, that these two are sibling processes. This is how the request has started, flown to this, then from here to here, it has flown to both of these two, and from the second one to this. So you can identify that there are only two processes that are spawned out from this original parent process. Then from this process again, you see that one process is spawned out. So you can see like that how the request flows within the system. Similarly, from Loki also, you will be able to basically see your traces. How? Just view the standard out, and suppose you identify that this is the log that is, the latency is higher than 100 millisecond, and I want to basically view this. So how do you view it? You just click on this. So these are basically derived fields. So you just basically click on this tempo. It's going to open up the tracing example again. So now we've talked about how we link metric traces and logs together, and shown you the demo. These are all the references that I use to build this slideshow together to give you guys an introduction to tracing. So happy tracing, guys.